Good evening, and wherever you're joining us from, a very warm welcome to Stroud Book Festival 2020. My name is Caroline Sanderson and I'm Artistic Director of the festival. Now, each year at Stroud Book Festival, we're committed to presenting a strand of events under the banner Sustainable Stroud. Last year, we invited Rob Hopkins, co-founder of the International Transition Town movement, to tell us about his book, What If? Now, book festivals, particularly when they bid for funding, are often asked to comment on the impact that their events have had. And we're thrilled that after we brought Rob Hopkins to Stroud last year, an initiative called Stroud Imagines came into being. This movement seeks to inspire our collective imaginations to tackle local issues and challenges, bringing together people in our community in the process. And Charlie Mitchell, our chair tonight, was one of the initiators of Stroud Imagines. So it feels entirely fitting that she'll be in conversation with our guest this year, Jonathon Porritt, for our event tonight in association with Transition Stroud, of which Charlie is also a director. So please take it away, Charlie.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening, Jonathon. Thank you so much for your time. You've had the most incredible career in environmental justice, including the chair of the Ecology Party, now the Green Party, director of Friends of the Earth and co-founder of Forum for the Future. I'd love to know what inspired you originally to get started in this incredible career.
I was a teacher for 10 years, and there's nothing more inspiring than having a chance to be with young people, help them discover the world in different ways. And it, for me, provided a kind of foundation on which everything else followed. I was at the same time, it has to be said, in the Green Party. So these two things overlapped. And I sometimes think that I wouldn't really be where I am today were it not for teachers' holidays and half terms, where it was Green Party activism without anybody wondering where the hell I was. But it was a fantastic opportunity, and that kicked in 1975. So from then on, it's kind of followed a certain path, that's for sure.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Fantastic. Thank you. I know young people are quite pivotal in your book that we're here to discuss this evening, Hope in Hell, which is just a fantastic overview, a really comprehensive exploration of the challenges that we're facing at the moment from an environmental perspective. And obviously in the context of COVID as well at the moment. It'd be great to hear your sort of overview of the book and a bit more detail from yourself.
Yeah, it's funny reflecting on it now, because of course when you sit down and write a book, you have absolutely no idea what the world will look like when you launch the book. And however many guesses I might have made back in October, November last year, I absolutely could not have guessed that Hope in Hell would be launched into the world as we've come to know it today. A world that is essentially constrained by the pandemic and struggling to make sense of all the different things going on. So in a way, it's forced me to think very clearly indeed about the comparison between how we're addressing this public health emergency, the pandemic, and how we're not addressing the climate emergency. And the contrast is very stark indeed. And I guess that we can draw lessons out of that, because when I was writing the book, I said, look, this is something we can still do. This is not too late. And there are, as you know, Charlie, there are quite a lot of people out there who actually think that it is already too late to do what we need to do to stop the climate, accelerate the change, accelerating faster and faster until it becomes irreversible climate change, at which point it is almost certainly too late. If we get to that point, then we will know that we've wasted all of these different years. But I do not believe that we have got to that point. So watching what governments around the world have been able to do to address a really horrendous short-term, in our faces right now emergency, namely COVID-19, is pretty astonishing. It seems there's literally no limit to what can be thrown at dealing with this, because it affects the lives of everybody on the planet, thousands, hundreds dying, and it'll get worse, obviously, over the next few weeks. But we can see the power of government to intervene at the point where an emergency is not any longer in doubt. So the question that I guess we need to explore this evening is, at what point does the climate emergency reach such a high level of public awareness and political traction and scientific certainty, and of course all of the evidence emerging in the planet itself in terms of climate-induced disasters? At what point can we then tip our systems over into treating this as a real emergency instead of what we're doing today, which is a kind of emergency for tomorrow? I describe it sometimes as an emergency in the making, as far as politicians see it. And that, of course, goes to this story about the tragedy of the horizon, that when something is literally right up close to us and we have to deal with it now, we can. And the resources of humankind are astonishing when we think about it. But when something's a little bit further out there and not quite causing the same angst in our regular way of life, in the economy, then we tend to push off the day when we have to address it as such. That tragedy of the horizon looms very large at the moment because, to be honest, the science now tells us that the climate is changing far faster than scientists predicted 10 years ago. It's changing in so many different ways all over the world. And the impact of that now on the lives of millions of people is already extremely severe, not just in terms of the economic damage, and that runs to many, many billions of dollars every year of economic damage. And just think about how we talk about the damage of COVID-19. Climate damage already entails huge costs for the economy, but it's also damage to people's lives. And sometimes we forget that. Here in the UK, where we've had really terrible flooding at many points over the last 5 years, it won't surprise you to know, Charlie, that there are still hundreds and hundreds of people in this country who have not got their luck because of really serious flooding. So just think about that as a little microcosm of what happens when half of your country is flooded. So Bangladesh, with really extraordinary flooding this year, and India with terrible flooding last year. This is the reality for millions of people, millions of people. So the science could not be clearer, as one wonderfully succinct summary put it at the end of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's latest report. Everything is getting worse everywhere, far faster than we once thought possible. I'll just leave it at that, because otherwise the rest of the evening could be a bit gloomy. And then you have to look to the politics of that. So what are we doing to address that accelerating crisis? And of course, we're not doing enough. That is the understatement of the evening. I will try and get better than that as we go on. We're not doing enough on any single part of the climate challenge. So what I wrote Hope in Hell for was to say, here is the science, here's what we know now, and here's what we can pretty much guarantee is going to happen over the course of the next 10, 20, 30 years, and some projections through to the end of the century, although I don't do too many of those because that isn't certain science, that's just speculation. So that's what the science says. Here is what the politicians are doing. Here's the gap between the two. How do you want to narrow that gap? Because if we don't narrow the gap now, the prospects for humankind are really seriously gloomy. And of course, the gap has to be narrowed in the next 10 years, because we have this challenge right now to halve emissions of the greenhouse gases that are causing the warming that is causing all the damage to climate systems. We have to halve emissions by 2030. So it's difficult to imagine a more emergency situation than that. And the book looks then at analogies for equally important progressive social causes that have changed things, but often over decades, not in short periods of time. It looks in particular at the role of young people in helping us accelerate this change process. And I hope comes to a reasonably certain conclusion that we still have the time to do it, but not unless we do things very, very differently from the way we're doing them today.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. That's a fabulous overview. It's been really inspiring to read about hope in this context, because you don't hold back. You don't pull, you pull quite a lot of punches with regard to the challenges that we're facing. So what gives you hope in this context right now?
Yeah, much harder question to answer now than it was before I started writing the book, because I've always been pretty much on the upbeat side of the story, that there are so many solutions out there and we just need to make them work. And given half a chance, people's predisposition is to be sensible and caring, responsible. I don't believe that humankind is essentially driven by all these dreadful, earth-trashing, narrow, me-first type behaviors. I don't believe that. So I've always been one who subscribed to the idea that we have the personal resources, the kind of resources as a species, and we have the technology resources. But then writing the book, I had to dig right down deep into that science, much deeper than I'd been for 10 years in reality. And of course, that tested my readiness to be positive right to the edge.
Absolutely.
So I came out of that with three things that are critical to me. First, I don't want anyone to think that technology isn't going to help here, because it really is. And we may or may not choose to go into that this evening, Charlie, but what's happening in the world of some of these technologies, renewable energy, storage, breakthroughs on different forms of land use and farming, breakthroughs on manufacturing. I mean, it's just incredible when you look at what the innovation pipeline offers us as a new way of creating wealth and distributing it more fairly. So for me, the technology side is important. Without it, trust me, you haven't got a hope in hell. That was the other half of the title of the book, as in this is all about hope in hell. You need to think about why maybe we haven't got a hope in hell. Take technology out of the mix and we haven't got a hope in hell. For those who don't like technology, I'm sorry, that can be a bit of a harsh message, but that's the reality. Secondly, there's the whole story about gathering awareness and readiness on the part of more and more people to step up and do what they know they need to do. And I've tried to span that spectrum of voices from the business community, again, not necessarily everybody's go-to place for helping out in the climate crisis, but far, far and away ahead of government already in terms, and given sensible political measures and policy, they would be able to step up much more than they can today. But I've balanced that with saying it's not just about business. You look at the spiritual community today, there are tons of things going on there that could be of enormous help. And then the third, and the bit that I'm sure we will want to talk about this evening, Charlie, is the role of young people. And for me, the contrast between the end of 2019, where a combination of Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes and young people on the streets of cities all around the world, 7 million young people by the end of 2019. And then what happened in 2020, when, of course, we lost that momentum completely because of COVID-19. That's a very painful contrast in our world today, very painful. But that role of young people is absolutely critical. And I personally believe that it'll be the single most important element in what we need to do now to narrow that gap that I was talking about.
Fantastic. I just wanted to mention as well to anybody watching that you're very welcome to ask any questions in the comments. I will be taking questions for Jonathan a little bit later. So please do, as we're discussing, please do ask questions. That would be wonderful to see. So tell me a little bit more about the role of young people in this future hopeful vision that you have.
Yeah. It works at many different levels. And I think that part of it is just reminding us, I'm generalizing here, us adults, that we have been playing fast and loose with the expectations of young people for a reasonably secure and stable planet for them to pursue their own dreams on, to achieve their own aspirations. And we have effectively been stealing that future of theirs in order to sustain a way of life for ourselves, a way of life that depends on undermining and destroying the planetary resources on which we all depend, a way of life that depends on us very, very aggressively favoring certain parts of society, the rich 1% of the 1% to the cost of pretty much the whole of the rest of humankind. And a system that, in a way, has been prepared to go on making that deal, whatever the interests of young people might be. So when I look at our collective responsibility from the perspective of young people, I am only too aware of the fact that a cry of rage that we heard back in 2019 is going to grow and grow and grow. And so it should, because we are morally reprehensible in the degree to which we have ignored their interests. So there's a story here about intergenerational justice. And because that voice is being raised by young people, it's a different voice. It reminds us of what we just take for granted. Parents, grandparents, whatever it might be, or even those who don't have children, there's an assumption that we do what we need to do to ensure that those who come after us can have a reasonable expectation of that kind. So that's the first thing. It's a different kind of voice. And secondly, it's unconstrained by where these arguments come from. I spent most of my life arguing about sustainability from an environmental perspective or a social justice perspective or a racial inequality perspective or a liberty and democracy perspective or whatever it might be. All of these things are seen as separate parts of what is in effect the same agenda, which is the justice agenda. Justice for people, the planet, all creatures on this planet, and so on. And honestly, one of the most invigorating things for me in working with young people on this whole agenda is they do not see the world packaged up neatly like this. It is completely ridiculous to suppose that social justice will be pursued by a whole bunch of organizations and people over here, and they don't really care about climate. And then on the other hand, you've got all the climate campaigners who really want to do their climate stuff, but they don't like social justice. And in the middle, you've got everybody else trying to make sense of it. Honestly, the decades I have wasted trying to persuade people that these things are all part and parcel, the same set of symptoms of a failing, dysfunctional economy. Young people don't do that. They absolutely get the fact that these things are all connected. And if we're going to address one part of that, we have to address all of it. I love that. It just makes me feel so good about the kind of intellectual credibility that they bring to bear on that.
It's fantastic, isn't it? It's fantastic, isn't it? It's very liberating and enlivening to get that energy. I really appreciate it.
Exactly.
You mentioned about intergenerational justice as well, and about supporting, different people working together. What's your vision for intergenerational aspect of this solution?
Okay, Charlie. Well, I haven't completely given up on people what I call in the middle. So anybody between the ages of 30 and 60. I haven't totally given up on them, but boy, are they one stodgy, destructive, difficult part of society to move. And it leaves me thinking that what is really going to matter now is the connections between those who are under the age of 25, let's say, and those who are above the age of 60. 65. I have this kind of crazy dream that we're going to see a completely new patterning of generational collaboration. And the stodgy, obstructive bit in the middle will go on being, probably more and more of them will get the message and will get involved in one way or another, but they'll still have careers to pursue. They'll still have some of the short-term interests they have to deal with. They'll still worry about credibility and respectability and, oh gosh, can I be associated with something as dodgy and dangerous as a non-violent direct action campaign? All of those things which we know loom large in people's minds doesn't matter a fig for young people, and increasingly I think won't matter very much to older people, because they will say, we have been unbelievably blessed to have lived most of our lives, not just in the Holocene era, to go back to this story about climatic stability, so during a period of time where the planet's climate has been remarkably stable, but also in a period of economic wealth where most people took for granted the fact that we would get jobs, we'd be able to get on the housing ladder, our education would be paid for, we had access to a really good national health service, etc. So we've had that post-war generation, we've done really well, we've prospered. And I think increasingly people now in that age range, 60 upwards, are beginning to say, yeah, it was great for us, or pretty good for us, because it wasn't great for everybody. It's been pretty miserable for far too many people still in society. But a lot of people can say it has been good, basically. But I can see now that that has only come at a certain cost to the expectations of young people. So I want to dedicate what I can now in terms of my energy, my passion, my commitment, my money, because people of that age may have resources to invest, to work with and alongside young people to ensure their voice is heard and ensure that politicians really do get the message from young people today and start changing their ways very differently. So that's my sort of crazy dream about intergenerational justice. Skip the stodgy bit in the middle and just wait until the oldies and the young people today start doing something that the world has never seen before, which will be a kind of collaboration, completely different.
It's very, very exciting. It's very, very exciting as a representative of the stodgy middle ground. I would like to just applaud you with that vision, because I'm really, really conscious that I'm not in a position to do the non-violent direct action that you speak about in the book, and I find it massively inspiring, and I can completely understand the need for that direction of travel, although it's not something that I'm able to do. So I really welcome that opportunity. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your perspective on that on the importance of that non-violent direct action that you mention in the book.
Yeah, and it is critical. And funnily enough, Charlie, it's not. I haven't really been in a position to do that kind of campaigning recently. I mean, when I was in the Green Party and Friends of the Earth, it was sort of, yeah, that was what campaigning was all about, and particularly in the Green Party, which has in its constitution, a support for non-violent direct action. And it's always been a critical part of our thinking and our practice, if you like. And I'm still a member of the Green Party today. But because of the work that I've been doing latterly, working with business and working with government as chair of the Sustainable Development Commission and various other things that I do, I have not been in a position to add my, not just my voice, but my body, as it were, to that pattern of campaigning. And I know I need to change that now, personally, because I can't advocate for civil disobedience in the way that I am, and non-violent direct action in the way that I am, if I'm not prepared to become involved in that myself. And I think that was a real turning point for me in writing the book. I suddenly realized you can go on writing as much as you like, Jonathan, but in the end, you're still going to be measured by your actions, not just by your words. So I have been really moved by the arrival of Extinction Rebellion in our midst. I'm being absolutely honest about this. I loved the first presence in our lives in early 2019. It was just so incredible to see that moment in people's lives, the tell the truth moment, everything about this, this completely different style of campaigning, to be honest. Went a little bit awry in October. Let's be honest, it didn't really work terribly well. And 2019 for Extinction Rebellion ended in a difficult place. I think the way Extinction Rebellion then have taken advantage of the COVID-19 crisis, a compulsory pause in their activities, has been the best thing for Extinction Rebellion that you can imagine. I loved the recent kind of campaigning that they brought back, not just onto our streets, but the way they were talking about it, much more inclusive, much more ready to embrace people at different points in their own activism, quite rightly reminding us that democracy and climate politics go hand in hand by stopping the Murdoch press from distributing its vile poison for at least 24 hours. I thought all of that was really inspiring. So for me, this whole story about giving people a reason to stop being bystanders and to become people who stand up for these things in practice is an absolutely critical part of it. Now, that does not mean to say that everybody has to be on the front line. Not everybody has to be taking part in nonviolent direct action and being prepared to be arrested. As XR constantly reminds us, that's not for everybody. That's not necessary for everybody. But you have to be supportive of those who are prepared to do that. And you have to think about how you can bring your voice and your actions to bear on that issue, even if you yourself, for whatever reason it may be, won't be there doing that action, that campaign. So I'm very keen about this new energy in the climate movement. Combine that with young people's campaigning, and I personally find it very inspiring indeed.
It's really interesting, and I know there'll be a lot of people watching, and certainly based in Stroud, the home of Extinction Rebellion, who'll be
absolutely
very, very interested to hear that perspective, and I'm sure will appreciate your energy that you're bringing to that arena as well. So yeah, fascinating. Okay, I'll just ask a couple more questions and then we'll get to some of the questions that are coming through. Thank you ever so much to people who are asking questions on the YouTube comments, and please do keep those questions coming. That would be wonderful. You've obviously, what I really appreciated about the book was this kind of eagle-eye view of all of these different challenges that you mention. There's the impact of China, the influence of billionaires, and the challenges, the ongoing challenges of social justice. I wonder how you manage to face these challenges without getting completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, I've lived with this sort of story. Well, I call it sometimes clutter in my inbox. This kind of sense of everything just bearing down on the same point. I've lived with it for so long that may be a survival tactic that I have been able to take advantage of, is to sift out the stuff that really, really matters and focus on that. And just sometimes to park the rest at the back of my mind, not let it dwell on the front of my mind. And it usually works, not always, but it usually works to keep that going. I'm also absolutely committed to bringing all these different issues together. So when this Black Lives Matter exploded in America and then in societies around the world, just as Me Too did a couple of years ago, these moments in societal thinking are critically important. And for me, that's what I mean. That's not the clutter. That's the front of mind stuff. Yeah. Where we can make these connections, where we can really put justice out there as an absolutely essential element in everything that we're doing. So I suppose it is a form of self-protection that I've developed over the years, but then a readiness suddenly to be completely bowled over by something and say, bloody hell, yep, that's it. Now we're going to weave this into the work that we're already doing. We have not got a finished, we've not got the fully integrated way of bringing the whole of society with us to this same point. So we need to be alert to these different shifts as they come in real time in society. And that is very uplifting. It's a very exciting thing to be able to do that sort of weaving process. I could also, of course, go slightly deeper into this. I also hug trees quite a lot, just in case you think, Charlie, that all of this is an intellectual kind of thing. I depend a lot on the natural world, and I don't get enough of it, but when I do, it means a huge amount to me, and it has always nurtured me and my activism, and it allows me to continue to do what I do, even at what are sometimes quite despairing, well, depressing. I tend not to have too many despairing moments, but I certainly have some pretty depressed moments, as I had on Tuesday evening when I wasn't quite certain whether Trump was going to be re-elected or not. But there you are, these things do happen. So.
That was definitely a moment.
It certainly was.
That brings us on beautifully to that importance of the nature connection, which you wrote about several times in the book, and it was really poignant to me. I've had my own journey with nature connection. You discussed rediscovering our total dependency on the natural world, and there was something for me that was really poignant about that total dependency. It's really clear. How do you feel that our nature connection is related to our motivation to protect it?
What I really enjoy about this, and it's funny in a way, is that this operates at least two different levels. One, there's a completely utilitarian reason for us to promote reconnection with the natural world, and that utilitarian reason is because of the benefits that it has for all of us from a health perspective, physical health and mental health. And the evidence about this now is honestly so overwhelming that it's just remarkable that the Department of Health hasn't yet cottoned on to the fact that one of the best ways of ensuring better quality of life and well-being for people is to ensure access to and contact with the natural world, what some people call the natural health service, as it were. But you've just got to wonder at that it's taken so long to get them to understand this. But the empirical data about that now is so incredible. You don't have to have any deep thoughts, let alone spiritual ideas about nature, to embrace that evidence and say, right, now we're going to use that to help improve the health outcomes for people in society today. But dig a tiny bit deeper than that, even a tiny bit deeper, and the lives of countless people are constantly enriched, if not on a day-to-day basis, by their opportunity to be in the natural world and to share those experiences with other people, sometimes even to go deeper and find this a really transcendental part of what they feel is really important for them. And I love the layering of this. Different people can connect in different ways at different points, but it all speaks to the same imperative of reconnecting those links, making sure that they inform our lives and making sure that they are available to everybody. Because the sad thing about access to the natural world is it is not equally distributed. And COVID-19 showed us that for an awful lot of people in society, the opportunity to be in their gardens or be in a park or walk somewhere was not available to large numbers of people in this country who did not therefore have the benefit of that beautiful spring weather that we had in lockdown 1. God knows what lockdown 2 in winter as it closes down on us is going to feel like. But we have to think about justice here as well, because the evidence about that was very, very clear. If you want nature to work as a beneficent force in people's lives, a healing force, we really have to address the reality of making that available to all people.
Fantastic. Thank you. I really appreciated seeing you write about spirituality and the importance of reflecting on spirituality within the book as well. That was really wonderful for me to see in such a scientific book, with so much data and so much information about where we're at. I'd love to move on to a little bit about innovation. You mentioned innovation earlier, and I was fascinated to read about the idea of electric planes, which I thought was a really interesting. Should we be holding on for electric planes as part of the solution?
Well, if you're a young person today, and it is interesting when you put their lens on all of these things, one of the big things they know they're losing is this opportunity just to travel in the way that so many people have been able to take for granted for so long. Although, just as a reminder, only 50% of the population of the UK ever used to get on a plane pre-COVID. So it's not exactly a general phenomenon. But for young people, it is still, there is a sense of loss about this, about not being able to go to other countries and explore and learn differently about the world. And electric planes, in that sense, may be part of a recovery for the aviation sector. And I say that because this is one sector that is not going to be recovering quickly. In fact, most of the sector do not anticipate a return to pre-COVID levels of traffic until 2023 at the earliest. So the whole of 21 and 22 will see a very different pattern of activity in the aviation sector. The one thing I'm celebrating is that COVID-19 has injected a sense of urgency into an industry that was unbelievably complacent. And the aviation industry sat there doing practically nothing for year after year after year, simply saying to themselves, people love flying. They're always going to want to get on planes. They'll always preference our carbon emissions, as it were. They'll give us permission to go on emitting carbon on their behalf over and above everything else, because that's how much people love us. And they fell into patterns of such complacency you can hardly imagine it. COVID-19 has shocked them out of that completely. So on things like electric planes, on sustainable aviation fuels, on the possibility of green hydrogen, all of these things, you've suddenly seen this little, everybody going beep, 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 beep. We've got to get our act together. We cannot expect that people will tolerate a rising level of emissions from the aviation sector, even as every other sector in the global economy reduces their emissions. There's no way people are going to put up with that. So we've got to get our act together. And I think we've seen more innovation in the aviation sector in the last 6 months than we'd seen in the previous 6 years. I really do. And it's fascinating to read. How much of it is real? How much of it will actually land in our lives? Will we get to fly on an electric plane or in a plane that is using industrial sustainable fuels, trapping the emissions from industrial process and turning them into sustainable fuels? I actually don't really know, Charlie, but I'm really glad that there are a ton of really quite sensible people working on this now.
That's fantastic to hear, and that's wonderful to hear. Yeah, it's wonderful to hear that such progress has been made in a relatively short space of time, and that's something I'm really grateful to COVID for. Okay, so we've got a few questions come through, so I'd like to just move on to ask those, if that's okay with you.
Of course.
So Sonia asks, what do you think of the idea of rewilding half the planet? E.O. Wilson's proposal to set aside half the Earth for preservation of biodiversity. Yeah,
isn't that an inspiring idea? You've just got to love that guy and that idea. Is that actually feasible? Actually, that's really the wrong place to start my answer. The right place to start my answer is we ought to be working to restore nature in as much of the planet as we possibly can, and to keep as much of it for nature, not for humankind, as we possibly can. The implications of that are pretty astonishing. It means, for instance, that meat consumption would need to be dramatically reduced, simply because our take of land for the food that we eat is driven in very large part by the hundreds of millions of hectares of land that we grow the grains and the feeds on to feed the animals that we then consume as animal-based protein. And if there's one thing you can absolutely guarantee, for us to get to anywhere close to 50% of nature for nature, not nature for us, the world will essentially be based on a plant-based diet. with very different patterns of meat consumption of a completely different kind. I totally celebrate that because, in a way, meat eating and protein coming from animal-based sources is one of the most destructive forces on this planet. So the implications behind the 50% figure are huge for our economy and for the ways in which our diets will need to change over the course of the next few decades. The only reason why I'm pausing about 50% is we need to use quite a lot of our land to ensure that we can sequester carbon. So in the book, I've tried to, it's a bit complicated to sort of get this through, but I've tried to concentrate on decarbonizing our industrial economy. So getting as much CO2 out of our industrial economy as we possibly can through renewables, et cetera, and then recarbonizing as much of our natural systems as we possibly can, particularly soil and forests.
Yep.
Now, rewilding will do that, but it takes a long time to do that. And there are question marks about whether we shouldn't look for instance, agroforestry as a way of combining food production with much more intensive forest cultivation. Whether we shouldn't look for forms of planting, of developing crops in such a way that more and more carbon is sequestered in the soil that is still being used for those crops. So instead of it going back to nature, it's being used for food production, but in a way that puts more carbon back in the soil rather than releases carbon. So I'm just raising one or two question marks. We can do what we need to do with the full 50% for nature, or whether we need, let us say, 50% for humankind, 30% for nature, and then the remaining 20% for a sort of hybrid where we are still using it, but it is beneficial to nature. That's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Fantastic. Sounds really interesting. Eric asks, any advice from your book on what particular actions we could or should be taking in Stroud?
I love the idea of me having anything to offer the citizens of Stroud that you haven't already been offered by the multiple wonderful organizations that exist in Stroud to help people live more sustainable lives and celebrate your wonderful reputation. It is just fantastic how many people will sort of point to Stroud as a place where priorities have been sorted out, where things begin to look very different, where opportunities to work collaboratively together to make good outcomes for the whole of the Stroud area and the Five Valleys make sense to an incredible number of people. I mean, I only live in Cheltenham, okay, so I'm just up the road from Stroud. And I can tell you, if we had a Stroudian perspective, is that the right word? Maybe not, but whatever. If we had a Stroud perspective on sorting out things in Cheltenham, bloody hell, Cheltenham would be one different kind of town from the town it is today. This is all me just prevaricating before trying to offer any advice. I'm just pointing out, and my interlocutor on this session, of course, yourself, Charlie, through Transition Stroud, will probably be able to offer much better advice to Eric than I would dare to offer. Are you allowed to do that with him offline to get him straightened out? Can I just add, I want to just say one thing, by the way, if I may, about local action, which is, it still depends too much on what are sometimes described as the usual suspects. So for me, one of the great tests of making our transitioning world, a more sustainable world, truly inclusive, is the challenge to each of us to bring people into that process who mightn't normally see themselves as part of that change process. And that it means that for every time we go to a meeting or get involved in a new action or initiative, you need a +1. You need to bring someone who isn't in it at the moment, who doesn't feel enthusiastic about it, really doesn't want to be bothered about about all this extra stuff. So think about your +1 and see what that might look like.
I think that's a very wise piece of advice, because if we're going to get to that 50% of people being positive about the environmental changes, we're going to need to be able to reach out to a lot more people. So that really resonates. Camilla asks, give us some examples of the best government actions.
Right. Well, let's start with the UK. All right, this will surprise you, because the UK, to be honest, is nowhere on most of these things, and it is a bit of a nightmare. But there are three things I just want to mention. Firstly, we were the first country in the world to have the equivalent, well, to have a Climate Change Act. And it was massively important. It established a consensus across parties. It gave people an opportunity to think about long-term planning for low-carbon futures. And other countries have now got the equivalent of the Climate Change Act. But we got there first. We were the first country in the world to commit to what is called net zero carbon by 2050. People seem to have forgotten this, but at the end of 2019, this was a country that signed up, the first industrial country to go for net zero by 2050. Far too far away, of course, 2050. It ought to be net zero by 2035, probably the latest, but nonetheless, we did that. And in my mind, by the way, that had a lot to do with the influence of the school strikes and Extinction Rebellion and so on. And thirdly, the one area where we still hold a lead, technologically, not for much longer, by the way, is offshore wind. And for all sorts of different reasons, this country has had an astonishing success story with offshore wind. And it is a bigger and bigger contributor to our net zero journey over the course of the next couple of decades. And we need to take that to the world. It really is important. So different countries do different things. If you ask me to come up with one country that has really completely got its head around this and is doing everything it needs to do, I can't give you an answer to that, because there isn't one country that is way out there. The Scandinavian countries are all doing fantastic things on decarbonizing their economies, but they still have grotesquely wasteful, profligate, consumerist lifestyles. New Zealand is doing fantastic stuff in terms of higher levels of renewable energy, trying to get its head around working with citizens through a citizens' assembly process. But New Zealand still doesn't really understand the nature of the challenge when it comes to agriculture. France has got some fantastic stuff going. I could run through all of this. You can see where this discussion will actually take us. If you allowed me to pick selectively from different countries, a bit like people who love football pick their ideal team of football players in a particular online league, I can't remember what the game is called now, whatever it's called, then I could give you the most amazing lineup of political initiatives all over the world. But they would be drawn from many different countries, because no one country has actually demonstrated to the rest of the world what this would look like. Unless you want to go to Costa Rica or something like this, which I'd love to go to, but unfortunately, it may not have the traction that we need with big industrial superpowers.
Fabulous, thank you. I've got a question from Clifford. Do you feel that older people have a responsibility to act as if they have nothing to lose?
Well, I suppose it depends slightly on older, what your definition of older is. Older people do still have things to lose. And it can be significant, but I think the thrust of what you're saying is that as one gets older, there is less reason to be nervous about what other people think of us. There's less reason to worry about whether our actions will cause people to feel contempt for what we're doing. There's less reason to worry perhaps about personal security, as long as we've got sufficiency in our lives as older people and we can track that sufficiency forward, then it's possible to take a different stance on how we use whatever personal incomes we might have, or whether we've got a pension pot. And I suppose it's at that level, it's getting the balance right between still needing to do the right thing by one's family, loved ones, children, etc. But then once you feel that you're doing what you can do as an individual, an older individual, to look after all those that you love and care for, then there's not much to lose in terms of putting the rest into play. And doing what you can then with whatever the resources might be. And very often those will be time resources, not money resources, because time can often be more available for people who aren't working full time. So I think it's that balancing story. We all have things to lose still in our lives, but older people can genuinely think about how to do that really proactively, and not just to think to themselves, okay, my life's sort of, that active bit of my life has come to an end. Maybe I don't now need to think of the rest of my life in quite such proactive terms. And that isn't a message that I hope anyone has kind of swallowed. That business about Extinction Rebellion saying, stop being a bystander, is not relevant just to young people or the stodgy bit in the middle. Stop being a bystander applies as much to old people as it does to young people. And I take that advice to heart, because we can't afford bystanders, especially ones who really have understood the nature of the crisis we face.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Adrian asks, with lockdown in England starting today and draconian limits on personal liberty, how hopeful are you of the government telling the nation the real changes that they need to make in order to reduce our carbon footprint?
I'm not hopeful about that at all, Adrian. There is a marked lack of honesty in talking about climate change in the way that we need to talk about it. That tell the truth message from Extinction Rebellion still hasn't really been followed through on. And when we hear the Prime Minister in a few weeks' time going into one of his great blustering speeches about what the UK will do to lead the world towards a low carbon nirvana, it'll be completely devoid of anything resembling the truth about the situation we're in. Politicians don't like doing this. But there's such a deep irony here, because actually confronting the climate emergency does not demand the same kind of sacrifices that confronting the COVID-19 emergency has done. We're not into that stage yet. We haven't arrived at the point where the first point of call for dealing with the climate emergency is the economic equivalent of total lockdown. We're just not there yet. We have got opportunities, fantastic opportunities, to build an economy back in such a way that we create prosperity without causing the continuing damage to the environment. That's a big ask. It's captured in that little hashtag no going back. And that means no going back to the kind of thoughtless kind of economic growth that we had pre-COVID. It means we have to do things really very differently indeed. So I'm surprised politicians can't be more truthful about this. There is a case to be made for the Green New Deal. There is a case to be made for putting all of our recovery spending into things that simultaneously promote low carbon prosperity for people, particularly at the local level. It's a very strong case. What have we had so far from government on this? Not a great deal. £2 billion for the Green Homes scheme, better than nothing, but it runs out in April next year. A few $100 million for inner city infrastructure to make it more friendly for cyclists and pedestrians and public transport. Okay. £40 million for conservation and environment organisations to create new jobs for the tens of thousands of young people who pretty soon will be unemployed. This is, I don't want to call this green peanuts, but it's the equivalent of green peanuts. I'm sorry, it really is. And you look at the 50 billion euros that Germany's putting into this and 40 billion from France. So Look, they turn away from the truth because they think people don't want to hear the truth. My sense is perhaps post-COVID, people will be more prepared to hear the truth and then act on it intelligently in a timely way.
That would be awesome. We're coming towards the end of our time together, I'm afraid, and I'm really sorry that we're not going to have an opportunity to ask all the questions that people have put through. I'm going to offer up an opportunity for people to discuss more next Wednesday about what we can do locally in Stroud as a result of this discussion. So there's an opportunity to get together with Stroud Imagines and Transition Stroud between 7:30 and 8:30 to discuss practical applications of what we can do as a result of this. Would you have any closing remarks about what you would like us to do as individuals to push for this change?
Somebody the other day reminded me of, I'd completely forgotten this, that when Al Gore, former Vice President Al Gore, was doing all his amazing training for young climate activists and was sort of all over the world helping people understand that, this is about 10 years ago, or maybe not quite so long as that, helping people understand the true nature of the science and what we can do about it. He summed up this story about what we all need to do so simply and elegantly. And for some reason, this had completely passed out of my mind. So he brings it down to three things: choice, voice, vote. And that is a brilliant summary. Choice in the way we spend our lives, buy things, prioritize things. The choices we make, they all have implications for good or ill. Voice, never hesitate about speaking up and saying what needs to be said. Whoever you're with, whatever the context, you have to use this as part of this change process. And then vote, because ultimately this is a political story. Climate change is not an environmental issue. Climate change is the biggest political challenge that the world has ever faced. So the voting bit is really critical. And people do have to think very carefully about how they cast their votes, particularly in a country which has a completely wretched first past the post electoral system, which makes it very hard for truly progressive green voices to be properly heard.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been such a privilege, and I've got probably another 100 questions that I could ask you this evening, Jonathan. But I really appreciate your time. It's been a real honour to spend this time with you, and thank you so much for the overview that you've given us and the hope that you're spreading with your message. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Charlie. It's been nice to spend the time with you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And thank you, Charlie, for that immensely absorbing and thought-provoking event, which I think also delivered a measure of optimism at a time when we sorely need one. You can buy Jonathan's book, Hope in Hell, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency, from our festival booksellers, Stroud Bookshop, stroudbookshop.com. We urge you to buy it from them or from your local independent bookshop at this very challenging time for independent retailers. And if you'd like to support Stroud Book Festival to programme events on sustainability and future, please consider making a donation to the festival. Details of how to do this are on our website, stroudbookfestival.org.uk. Tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the evening, we present How to Argue with a Racist by BBC broadcaster and geneticist Dr. Adam Rutherford. And then at 8:30 p.m. tomorrow night, we'll be in the company of award-winning Jamaican poet Kai Miller as he reads from his latest collection, In Nearby Bushes. So please do join us then. For now, it's good night from the whole Stroud Book Festival team.